All right. So we missed last week because of the gospel meeting for our class. So the last class on the 12th, those notes are back on the table, as well as the reorganized timeline. I have extended it so it's not quite as jumbled. We've got 0 to about 60 AD on the first page, and then starting 60 AD going forward through 100 AD. Those are front and back on the table. Also, like I said, the notes are back there as well. And I did want to cover something that we did not get to cover that I didn't even notice wasn't in my notes from the last class. So we talked about the three Jameses and then Jude. But then in our list, which also you'll note also includes some of the information we talked about 2 weeks ago, some of the, I don't like to call it necessarily history because it's just kind of what has been said, what happened to them for 1800, 1900 years or so, legend, whatever, however you want to say it, that is outside of the history of the New Testament. But we have Andrew, we talked about him, James, and then we talked about John, who was presumably the last apostle to die. He was exiled to Patmos during the persecutions under Domitian. According to Tertullian, John was banished after being plunged into boiling oil in Rome and suffering nothing from it. I had never heard that particular part of it before. I included it because, again, some of these historians like Tertullian, whether or not it's accurate, that's what he said. It is said that all in the audience of the Colosseum were converted to Christianity upon witnessing this miracle. This event would have occurred in the late 1st century during the reign of Emperor Domitian, who was known for his persecution of Christians. John said to have lived to an old age, dying at Ephesus sometime after 98 AD. The other one that wasn't, again, like I said, I didn't even notice wasn't on our list of what happened to the apostles was Thaddeus. I was going through our notes from 2 weeks ago, and I go through everything, I'm like, well, where's Thaddeus? And of course, we mentioned 2 weeks ago that his common name, or the name that he actually went under, his surname was Thaddeus. We know him as Thaddeus, but his actual name was Lebbaeus. But there is some evidence to suggest that this is the same man as Jude, who wrote the book, the Gospel, or the Epistle of Jude, as well as potentially the brother of Jesus. He's the brother of James, possibly Jesus. We talked about that 2 weeks ago. According to tradition, St. Jude suffered martyrdom about 65 AD in Beirut, in the Roman province of Syria, together with the apostle Simon the Zealot, with whom he is usually connected. The axe that he is often shown holding in pictures symbolizes the way in which he was killed, presumably with an axe. A plain ossuary, I thought this was interesting, a plain ossuary marked with the inscription Judas Thaddeus was found in Kefar Baruch, Jezreel Valley, alongside fragments of 4 uninscribed ossuaries. So I thought that was interesting because in the lists of the apostles that we have, some of them list Jude or Judas, not Iscariot, and then we have in some lists Thaddeus, and those are the only differences between the lists. And the idea is that Thaddeus also remember we had Simon, Peter, Barjona. You know, some of these men had 2 or 3 different names that they were known by or surnames, and Thaddeus, it is believed, is also the Judas or Jude. So I wanted to kind of cover that before we moved on into this week's notes. Thoughts or comments between our timeline and our this stuff I added here for our notes from last week or 2 weeks ago. All right. Now, as I've mentioned in the past, this is more lecturing than it is anything else, and I apologize for that. But the hope is that we'll kind of get through a lot of this and into more of the evidences beyond the history fairly quickly. Now, next week, presuming we get through all of this, next week the plan is to cover those who are called the early, quote, church fathers. Okay, this is Ignatius and a lot of these men who are recorded in history, who have certain writings attributed to them. Some of them are referenced in the New Testament, some are not. So we will talk about some of these men and talk about some of their writings, some of which may be accurate to that individual, but some of these writings certainly either are not accurate to that individual or that individual had fallen off from the faith when they wrote it. And so we'll talk more about that next week. So, as we get going here, we're going to talk about Timothy, Titus, Barnabas, John Mark, and Luke. Since we talked about the apostles 2 weeks ago, we also talked about, and I didn't include this on my notes because I'll figure out a way to put it together, but I wanted to have them separate. We talked about Nero, and we talked about the persecution that arose under Nero, and we talked about the first Roman-Jewish war, first Jewish-Roman war, also known as the Great Rebellion. We talked about that leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem. So that'll be on a separate set of notes for that. So moving into Timothy, Titus, Barnabas, John Mark, and Luke. So starting with Timothy, and again, let me emphasize that where I do have what we know is accurate, I'll have the text of the scripture, I'll have the scripture there. But the rest of this is simply from what's been said, what is according to tradition or according to secular history, whether it's completely accurate or not, take it with a grain of salt. But I thought some of this was very interesting. So with Timothy, that Timothy was jailed at least once during the period of the writing of the New Testament is implied by the writer of Hebrews, mentioning Timothy's release at the end of his epistle. Remember, the writer of Hebrews was writing from Italy somewhere, according to Hebrews chapter 13. He does mention Timothy, but he refers to Timothy as our brother Timothy. And of course, certainly Timothy was a brother to Paul in the faith, but Paul refers to him as a son in the faith. So again, as I've mentioned before, there are different people. Some people attribute the writing of Hebrews to Barnabas, some even to Luke. I tend to lean towards John Mark personally. The apocryphal Acts of Timothy states that, again, this isn't written by anyone inspired, but this is basically tradition that has been written down, states that in the year 97 AD, the 80-year-old tried to halt a procession in honor of the goddess Diana by preaching the gospel. The angry pagans beat him, dragged him through the streets, and stoned him to death. So that is what was written at 80 years old in 97 AD. Again, Timothy's not an apostle, but he certainly was a key component of the spread of the gospel, especially during and after Paul's imprisonments in Rome. I did want to read also, I've got something in here about Timothy as well. Here. It has a little bit of more detail as to what was actually recorded. I don't know if y'all can see that or not. It's again, take some of this with a grain of salt. But after Timothy had visited Paul at Rome, he returned to Ephesus, where he continued to govern the church as one of the bishops, or elders, without the least interruption for a considerable time, till at length he fell a victim to the malice of the pagans, who were his most inveterate enemies, which they would have been enemies of his, not him of them. These heathen made a great feast, in the celebration of which they carried in procession the images of their idols, being specifically Diana, being all masked and armed with clubs and other offensive weapons. Timothy, seeing the procession, again, the wording of this was so irritated at their idolatry, I'm guessing more likely, if this is indeed accurate, righteously indignant at their idolatry and superstition, that he rushed in among them in order to stop their proceedings, upon which they immediately fell upon him, and with their clubs beat him in so unmerciful a manner that he soon expired. They left the body on the spot where they had murdered him, which was removed thence by some of his disciples, and decently interred on the top of a mountain at a small distance from the city. The Greeks commemorate his martyrdom on the 22nd of January, the day of which it is supposed he gave up his life in defense of the doctrine he had long labored to propagate, and during which time he had brought over great numbers of people to embrace the truth of the Christian religion. So I kind of thought some of the details in that were kind of interesting. It certainly, I would not be at all surprised, for Timothy being willing to die according to the truth of the gospel. I certainly don't think he instigated it, But if any of this is accurate, I would not be surprised by him certainly standing up in Ephesus against the teaching or against the worship of Diana. And as we know from Paul's experiences in Ephesus, people didn't really handle that whole issue of not worshiping Diana very well. So for Timothy, if that is indeed the truth, that's how Timothy died, it doesn't surprise me too much. So, thoughts through Timothy? Yes, sir.
That, to me anyway, does not sound like anything the apostles did, anything that we read about, anything that they taught.
In terms of stopping the proceedings of worshiping Diana? Yeah.
Just sounds like something invented by a more militant.
Right, idea. Which, and that's why I say, if it did happen, I tend to think that he didn't instigate it. He may have preached against the teaching of Diana, though, certainly, and in Ephesus. And I can certainly see the followers and the worshipers of Diana getting all upset and angry over it and killing him. And that's how it was written down. Okay? But yeah, no, I agree. I don't believe he instigated anything. But I thought some of the details of that were kind of interesting. Anything else through discussion of Timothy? Okay. Talking about Titus now. Early church tradition holds that Paul, after his release from his first imprisonment in Rome, stopped at the island of Crete to preach. Due to the needs of other churches requiring his presence elsewhere, he left Titus to finish the work he had started. Paul summoned Titus from Crete to join him at Nicopolis in Epirus. We see that in Titus chapter 3, verse 12. Later, Titus supposedly traveled to Dalmatia. He returned to Crete and remained there into his old age, dying at age 94 in Gortyna, near the city of Candia, which is modern Heraclion. So the thought process is that he did return to Crete and continued to preach and teach there. In fact, one source that I looked at suggested he was an elder at one of the churches there, and that there is nothing that suggests that he necessarily died from being put to death, but that he died from old age. Again, Titus was not an apostle, but Titus also was a key companion of Paul as well. So, thoughts about Titus? All right, Barnabas. Talking about Barnabas, of course, we know the history of Barnabas and Paul. We've discussed in our Acts class in Acts chapter 15 about their disagreement over John Mark. So Barnabas, after having left Paul, remember Paul took Silas and continued on to journey around to the churches. Barnabas took John Mark to Cyprus. And we don't learn or hear anything after that about Barnabas. Now, John Mark, we do hear later in the book of Galatians that he's become useful, or to the Colossians rather, he's useful to him for the ministry and so forth. So that does come, John Mark does come up later. But Barnabas, although the date, place, and circumstances of his death are historically unverifiable, Christian tradition holds that Barnabas was martyred at Salamis, Cyprus in 61 A.D. Remember, we talked about Salamis in Paul's travels, and Salamis is one of those cities on Cyprus. After he returned to Cyprus, his native country, he suffered martyrdom in the following manner. Certain Jews coming from Syria and Salamis, where Barnabas was, then preaching the gospel, being highly exasperated at his extraordinary success, fell upon him as he was disputing in the synagogue, dragged him out, and after the most inhuman torture stoned him to death. His kinsman John Mark, who was a spectator of this barbarous action, privately interred his body in a cave. Certainly wouldn't surprise me if Barnabas did die in Cyprus. Okay, the fact that it's referenced 61 A.D., whether that's accurate or not, I don't know. Again, I would have, and again, it's possible that Paul and his letters that he wrote between 61 and his death in 66, it wasn't appropriate to bring up Barnabas at that point. We don't have any record of Barnabas having died in 61 A.D. or anywhere else in the New Testament, but that is what the tradition holds, that he was killed in Cyprus. Thoughts or comments about Barnabas? All right. John Mark. Now, John Mark is kind of an interesting background in terms of what we attribute John Mark. He was the nephew of Barnabas. Okay, we're familiar with that concept. But the fuller extent of John Mark's history is kind of interesting because, and we'll read this and I'll talk a little bit more about him. He was sent by Paul to Colossae in Colossians chapter 4, verse 10, serving with him in Rome. We see that in 2 Timothy chapter 4. From Pentapolis, he made his way to Alexandria. Here's where tradition kicks in. When Mark returned to Alexandria, the pagans of the city resented his efforts to turn the Alexandrians away from the worship of their traditional gods. In AD 68, they placed a rope around his neck and dragged him through the streets until he was dead. So that is the tradition associated with John Mark. And interestingly enough, of course, the only Mark mentioned in the New Testament is John Mark. And so typically the Gospel of Mark is associated to John Mark. And again, like I personally, my thoughts tend to lean towards him also being the writer of Hebrews. I can't prove that, but that's kind of my thought process. So anything through John Mark. And of course, we know at one time there was something in the way of his being willing to stay with Paul and Barnabas when they got to Asia Minor in Acts, I guess at the end of Acts chapter 13. So he went back to Jerusalem, back home where he was from, where he grew up. And then Paul had something against that thought process, whatever that was. Of course, it's generally considered John Mark was one of the youngest out of all of these lists of people we're talking about. So he would have been very young probably in Acts chapter 13. So there might have been some fear involved. He may have come up with some reason why I need to go home. Maybe he was homesick. I don't know. But Paul didn't consider it an appropriate reason to go back. But fortunately, John Mark more than made up for it later. Luke. All right, Luke is known. There are some. I thought it was interesting in the source I was looking at. I didn't understand what the differentiation was, but they said there are some modern higher scholars. I'm like, what's a higher scholar? I don't know what that is, but there are some modern higher scholars that suggest that possibly Luke was a Hellenized Jew. Maybe, maybe not. But what Paul says is very interesting in that at the very least we know he wasn't born Jewish. But he was the only Gentile, non-Jew, to write books of the Bible. We see Colossians chapter 4, and this is where kind of the main reason exists for which we understand that he was not born a Jew. Paul mentions, my fellow prisoner Aristarchus sends you his greetings, as does Mark, that's John Mark, the cousin of Barnabas. Jesus, who is called Justus, also sends greetings. These are the only Jews among my co-workers for the kingdom of God, and they have proved a comfort to me. So those who were with him, these are the ones who are Jews. But then later in verse 14, he references Luke and Demas. Our dear friend Luke, the doctor, and Demas send greetings. So these two are listed separate from the Jews. Whether Luke or Demas were ever Hellenized Jews, which is to say they were proselytes, Gentile proselytes who embraced Judaism before they became Christians, maybe. But at the very least, they were born Gentiles. As a physician, Luke must have been curious about the medical conditions behind Christ's miracles. In the Gospel of Luke, there's a lot of specifics that are mentioned, a lot of medical terms that are mentioned regarding the miracles that Jesus did. As a matter of fact, Luke uses more medical terms than any other New Testament writer. For example, he doesn't just say that Publius' father was sick in Acts chapter 27 and 28 that we studied a couple weeks back. This would have been Publius on the island of Malta. He doesn't just say that he was sick. He tells us he suffered from fever and dysentery. He is believed to have been a martyr, reportedly having been hanged from an olive tree. Luke died at age 84 in Boeotia, according to a, quote, fairly early and widespread tradition. So I thought that was really interesting about some of those details about Luke being hanged from an olive tree in Boeotia at the age of 84. Thought that was interesting. Thoughts about Luke? Yes, sir.
I think the reason why these higher scholars consider him a Hellenized Jew is because of his
because of how he wrote?
From what I understand, yes, Luke and Acts, except the passages in Luke which reference things that happened that were probably told to Luke. That's one of the interesting things from my studies. He goes back to a more Aramaic type language and then reverts back to this real outstandingly clear and classical Greek style. An educated
Yeah.
man in any case.
Yeah, absolutely educated. Yeah, which suggests that his natural language was certainly Greek. Yeah. All right. Anything else about Luke? All right. Let's see. Do we have? Okay. So that concludes the discussions of Timothy, Titus, Barnabas, John, Mark, and Luke. These were kind of the 5 main ones outside of the apostles. Not to say that they're any more important than anyone else mentioned as being companions of Paul or anyone else. But these are the ones that right off the bat we identify, we understand who these individuals are because we have the most references to them in the writings, especially the epistles of the New Testament. So we kind of talked about them, and of course there are others, lots and lots of others that are called companions of Paul and companions of the saints and so forth, that we won't go through all of those, but those are the 5. So outside of these 5, so like for next week, for instance, we're not done here yet, but for next week, is there anyone else that you would like to kind of find out some more about what history or tradition says happened to them? Anyone in addition to these 5 outside of the apostles that we haven't covered? Okay. So because this covers, we have now covered all of the main writers of the New Testament. Matthew, of course, being an apostle. Matthew, Mark, John would have been John, Mark. Luke, the physician. Of course, we talked about John, the apostle. And then all the way through, we talked about James, talked about Jude, talked about Peter. So all of the writers of the New Testament, again, asterisk, Hebrews, we've covered all of these authors and what traditionally is considered having happened to them. All right? So I've been debating exactly how to go forward, and I kind of have changed my mind in terms of going decade by decade through 100 AD. We're still going to do that going forward a little bit, but I'd like to kind of center on certain subjects within that period of time. So for instance, for the rest of our class today, we're going to talk about the major persecutions that the saints encountered really from Nero in the mid-60s AD through the 300s AD, the major persecutions that the saints endured. We're going to talk about that, especially since we've just talked about the apostles and those 5 that out of all of them, only 2 or 3 perhaps may not have been killed for their faith. John, the apostle, being one, but all the rest of them suffered death because of their faith. So given that context, I felt the segue was would flow nicely talking about the major persecutions that they faced. This is not going to include major persecutions from the Jews. Okay, keep in mind, Jesus warned through John the Apostle in Revelation that there would be more persecution from Jews, as he referenced there in the 90s AD, that this was going to continue to take place, and there was a reference to that. So we'll talk a little bit about, maybe at the beginning of next class, a little bit about what we know about possible Jewish persecution after 60s AD or so. But in most historical, most written down information that we have involves Rome specifically. All right, so last class we talked about the Great Rebellion, the Great Revolt that took place, that led to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70, and ultimately the finality to it was the destruction of that Fort Masada in 73. So prior to Nero's accusation of arson and subsequent, remember we talked about that a little bit, that the thought process was that Nero was the one that started the Great Fire of Rome, but then he blamed the Christians to try to deflect the guilt and the thought process off of him. Arson, subsequent anti-Christian actions in 64, all animosity was apparently limited in terms of official action, limited to Jewish hostility. That's official action. That's not to say like Paul in Ephesus when he faced Alexander the silversmith, or Demetrius. Was it Demetrius or Alexander? Because he references another silversmith later. Is it Alexander? Was it Demetrius? Demetrius. And then Alexander's mentioned some other time. But all those that, the Gentiles that would get upset and angry at them, that's not what this is reference to. The official action of Rome is what this is a reference to. So certainly there were persecutions against Christians by Gentiles on their own that were not sanctioned by Rome. All right? But in terms of before Nero, the animosity that was official and unofficial for that matter, but the Sanhedrin certainly approved of it, was all from the Jews. So from the time of Nero, around 64 AD, until the conversion of Emperor Constantine and the Edict of Milan in 313, whereby Christianity was made legal, the Christian faith was officially regarded as a religio prava, which means evil or depraved religion. Primarily, why do you think it was considered a depraved religion? What do you think the primary reason for that was? Okay, worshiping someone who had been crucified and they taught was raised from the dead. Certainly that would not have been believable for some Romans.
Could it be the Lord's Supper because of the body and blood of Christ?
Okay. There may have been some of that. Certainly there were Jewish oppositions to that as well.
But from I know the Catholic Church hasn't formed yet, but
Yeah.
because that came from somewhere, and
Right.
I just wondered if that was...
Right. Well, certainly the Jews expressed, even when Jesus was alive, when Jesus would talk about the eating of his flesh and the drinking of his blood, the Jews expressed there was some, even though the term cannibal was never specifically brought up in the Gospels, they were kind of sort of thinking along those lines. What do you mean we have to eat you? What do you mean we have to drink your blood? So certainly there probably would have been some thought process as to what in the world does that mean from those who were not taught that Jesus wasn't speaking literally. But when you think of especially Rome as a nation, okay, so that's one, is that the Christians refused to worship Caesar, but kind of attached to that line of thinking would be what's the biggest difference between what Rome believed and what the Christians believed? And not talking about morality or anything else, but just the basic fundamental difference. Monotheism, polytheism. The fact that the Christians would not worship, it's not so much that they included Jehovah in their worship, but that they refused to worship the Roman gods or the Greek gods. That in and of itself was a major problem. In fact, we're going to see later that one of the major persecutions that arose came, and what these Christians were, what everyone, in fact it was an edict that was sent out through all the empire, was that every citizen had to receive a certificate stating that they had offered a sacrifice to one of the Roman gods to prove their allegiance to the Roman pantheon of gods. And if Christians were willing to do that and denounce Christ by doing so, then they would be able to be set free if they were in fact found to be Christians. So those who refused to, again, not that they believed in Jehovah, but that they refused to worship the Roman gods, that was the primary main reason for this hostility or why Christianity was considered an evil or depraved religion. The early Christians were the targets of repeated persecutions, some of unspeakable cruelty. For example, the Emperor Nero blamed the Christians for the Great Fire that destroyed 10 of the 14 city wards at Rome in 64, a fire that Nero apparently had, again, there's no proof specifically that says Nero did it, but everybody of that time thought Nero did it, that Nero had ordered himself. The historian Tacitus, not a Christian, said that Nero had the believers torn by dogs and nailed to crosses, even used as human torches to illumine his gardens at night. And we've referenced that action in the past, what all Nero had done. Of course, he started out at least a little bit reasonable in his early years as an emperor, but by the mid-60s, he'd become extremely paranoid, extremely cruel, extremely mindful of those who were speaking against his authority. And so the Christians ultimately bore a lot of the brunt of that hostility. According to some so anything through, really this is just kind of surrounding some of this stuff that we've talked about. Anything through this point C. All right. According to some historians, Jews and Christians were heavily persecuted toward the end of Domitian's reign. Domitian, we talked about Domitian, he was one of the main emperors who, at the writing of the Gospel of John, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and possibly even Revelation, Domitian certainly would have been a reference to, or would have been kind of referenced to by Jesus in some of the things that he wrote to the 7 churches of Asia. The great persecutions that they'd already gone through, how that they were being thrown in prison, and those who were at the seat of, at Caesar's seat, and so forth in Rome. This is the type of Caesar that Jesus was talking about, was Domitian. He reigned again from 89 to 96. The book of Revelation, which mentions at least one instance of martyrdom, we see that in chapter 2, verse 13, is thought by many scholars to have been written during Domitian's reign. Early church historian Eusebius wrote that the social conflict described by Revelation reflects Domitian's organization of excessive and cruel banishments and executions of Christians. But these claims may be exaggerated or false, although we know for a fact that who was exiled during that period of time? John the Apostle. He himself references in Revelation chapter 1 that John, he was on the island of Patmos, and he had been exiled there. Of course, the thought process is that he wasn't exiled there for the rest of his life. At some point he got off, but then later was killed, or later died somewhere else. But Christians were not under persecution everywhere and all the time. There were periods that were relatively peaceful. Again, the angle of these sources is looking at it from the perspective of official action. Okay, this is not necessarily persecution from my neighbor or from the people in town. That certainly would still arise, okay, between the Gentiles and the Jews. There were certainly those things that were still there. But in terms of official action and official government, maybe not so much official government sanctioned, but government approved or government allowed persecution, it wasn't all the time. The persecutions were sporadic with peaceful intervals in between. They varied in their intensity and were mostly localized. Between 109 and 111, Pliny the Younger was sent by the Emperor Trajan. Remember, 2 weeks ago, I was going to say last class, we ended our class talking about Trajan and how he was, at the beginning, he was kind of a much more calmer emperor at the beginning, but he also enjoyed being glorified as a god. He wanted his family glorified and so forth. He reigned from 98 to 117 AD. So he sent Pliny the Younger to the province of Bithynia in Anatolia as governor, and their correspondence is considered a valuable historical source. In one of his letters, Pliny reports on his actions with regard to some people who had been denounced as Christians, some of them anonymously. Those that persisted in confessing that they were Christians he had executed, or if Roman citizens, sent to Rome. Those who denied that they were Christians he subjected to the test of invoking the gods, offering them incense and a libation in the presence of an image of the emperor, and cursing Christ. Some who admitted that they had formerly been Christians, but proved by passing this test that they were no longer Christian, declared that Christians did not commit the crimes attributed to them, a declaration confirmed under torture by 2 slave women who were called deaconesses. And of course, this is not an official office term as in a deacon. This is the term like Phoebe in Romans chapter 16. She was a servant. They were referred to as deaconesses. They were servants of the saints. Christians also. So what's being described is how Pliny the governor handled this situation. This is not something that was ordered by Trajan, but this is something how Pliny handled these certain circumstances. And all through, really from the hundreds AD through 300, there were different crimes that were associated to Christians. Some of these were completely made up. Okay, some of these were just bogus completely. But a lot of times, because Christians stood against serving the gods of Rome, people would in some way, just like they did with Jesus, just like they did with Paul, in some way attribute some kind of evil action against the Roman gods, as opposed to they simply are serving their one God. So there would be some sort of legal crime that they would be accused of. And that's what this is referring to. There were some apparently who had fallen away, those who denied that they were Christians. They went through this test. They offered up a sacrifice to an altar or an image of Caesar. They cursed the name of Christ. But they who had done this, they also declared that Christians did not commit the crimes attributed to them. So people who were accusing Christians of crimes, these Christians who fell away said, Christians aren't like that. They are not guilty of those things. Even though I'm no longer a Christian, they're not guilty of that. So, at least there's that. Let's see. Pliny therefore asked the emperor whether ceasing to be a Christian was enough to secure pardon for having been one, and whether punishment was merited just for being a Christian, the name itself, or only for the crimes associated with the name. Like I said, whether they were bogus or made up, or they in some way had something to do with, and I believe many of them were bogus, but I think some of them probably also had to do with this denial of worshiping the gods of Rome, or the Roman gods. Trajan responded that the problem could only be dealt with case by case. The authorities were not to seek Christians out, but people who were denounced and found guilty were to be punished unless, by worshiping the Roman gods, they proved they were not Christians, having denied Christ, as part of that test, cursing the name of Christ, and so obtained pardon. Anonymous denunciations were to be ignored. So, this is in the 100s AD, early 100s, 101 to, 101 to 111. These are some of the letters that Pliny wrote back and forth with Trajan. So thoughts through that particular events, those particular issues the Christians had to face. Now imagine, and there is a certain, it depends, of course I guess it depends on who you talk to, but there are certain thought processes automatically attached to when we call ourselves a Christian. Okay, now anymore today in our religious society, calling yourself a Christian can mean any number of things. And it can include the idea that I'm a Christian, but I don't really live like one. I'm free, I can do what I want to, but I'm a Christian. But among people who really truly believe in what the scriptures teach regarding their conduct and so forth, there's a certain conduct expected of Christians. But associated with that, in fact, I forget who it was I was talking to. I was talking to one of our fellas, and they said that they mentioned, I think it was about the gospel meeting or something, but they mentioned that they were of the Church of Christ, and someone responded about, are you those people who don't believe in bands and guitars and that sort of thing in your services, and you just sing with your psalm books and stuff, right? So there's a certain, with some people who are aware, there's a certain understanding of beliefs associated with, as in this case, the name of Christian or the name of the body of Christ. And so imagine having to go through a situation that they were facing. We know that things seem to be getting worse than they have been in recent decades for us, at least in terms of society's view of religion and of Christianity. But it still is nothing compared to what our brothers and sisters in Christ 2,000 years ago faced. Anything through A, B, C, D, E, F, G, F. Anything through F. Yes, ma'am.
I just think of a passage in Hebrews 12, of whom the world was
Not worthy. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, the world. Yeah, Hebrews chapter 11 dealing with the people of faith, and into chapter 12. Yeah, that was a major point that the Hebrew writer wanted to make. The world was not worthy of these people of faith, these people who were willing to die for their faith. Yeah, I mean, the Hebrew writer talked about people being sawn in half and, being eaten by animals and so forth. It was, yeah. All right. Yes, sir.
I have a question for you.
Yep.
Because we see the persecution laid upon Christians really through the first century and what's recorded in the book of Acts. In Acts chapter 8 says that the church, Saul made havoc of the church. He was dragging Christians to prison. And you get to verse 4, it says they were scattered.
Yeah.
But those who were scattered went out preaching the word everywhere. And that always blows my mind that the reason that you're under such great persecution is your confidence in the truth.
Yeah.
And so, there's a lot of attributes offered for why that took place, that it was the Lord's way of spreading the gospel throughout all of the world, which I wouldn't dismiss that. But the connection to it is often that here in the United States, we're free, we suffer zero persecution. And what are we doing with all of this freedom? And I'm just wondering, how much weight do you put into that? Because we know that God provides the increase. So,
Right.
I wanted to see what you thought about that point. Why is persecution needed for us to be more serious about the truth?
I think in a lot of ways, persecution, the first aspect to that is it kind of sifts between those who are true and those who simply claim to be. Like the parable of the sower where the seed is sown on the stony places. That's describing people who are Christians, but as soon as persecution arises, adversity comes along, they just fall over because they don't have root. So I think the very first part of that would be the fact that because persecution tests us by fire, it creates within us a determination not to fail, not to cede to the desires of others for us to renounce the name of Christ or anything else. And because of that, I think it becomes a very obvious thing for other people to see. So when other people are looking for meaning, for substance, when they see other people being persecuted and yet not choosing to bow down to that persecution, but instead even dying to the point of that persecution, that in of itself is a teaching tool. Okay, that in of itself presents people with who would be willing to die for something if it didn't have merit. And in a lot of ways, I believe the early church, that's what they proved through that persecution was, we're willing to die for this. Not to say that they ran away because they weren't willing to die. They spread out in teaching the gospel. Obviously, scattering was not wrong for them to do. That was part of the plan of God. But even amidst all of that, it was still causing problems among the Jews, and then eventually when the Gentiles were being taught, among the Gentiles. And yet it still didn't change anything in terms of for the Christians. They're still determined, and they weren't adversarial or militant about it, but at the same time they were firm. This is what the Bible teaches. This is what proof has been given about the Son of God. So I believe that the main answer to your question would be the fact that it shows the difference between someone who's a true Christian, someone who's fake. And then that example of a true Christian going through that persecution provides an example to people who are watching. And those who, and even for those who are Christians who would falter when they see another fellow Christian going through it, it can strengthen them up to be willing to go through it themselves. That certainly isn't a comprehensive answer, but within the time allotted, that hopefully that helped a little bit. All right, so we'll stop there. We'll pick up with the rest of this next class, as well as talking about the quote-unquote early church fathers. Thank you, everybody, for the thoughts and comments.